Okay, let's unpack this. You probably came to us because you're curious, maybe even a little frustrated.
Mhm.
You sense there's this deep current running underneath the surface of daily politics in the news.
Mhm.
You're wondering why certain headlines just seem to flood the news cycle while other, really critical stories just vanish. Or why, doesn't matter who wins an election, the big structural government policies, from military spending to global trade, they seem absolutely set in stone.
And that frustration is completely rational. It's a sign that you're paying attention. We're here today to uh, to bypass that surface level theater of
The
politics.
campaign ads, the debates.
Exactly, all of that, and move into a much more rigorous structural analysis. Our mission here is to really get a thorough understanding of the core institutional plumbing that concentrates power, that ensures these narrow policy outcomes, and, crucially, fixes the fundamental premises of public discourse.
So this is a deep dive into two sort of intersecting models of control. First, we're going to analyze the framework that explains why specific narratives dominate the media and, well, marginalize dissent. That's the propaganda model.
Right.
Then we're going to expose the financial and legislative mechanisms that act as an invisible leash on governments all over the world, guaranteeing that a very narrow set of elite interests, always wins out in the end.
And the foundational question we're really chasing is this. Is political influence just about who writes the biggest checks to politicians? Or is there a much deeper institutional structure, something rooted in the very nature of capital, of ownership, of market forces that predetermines the outcome?
So we're talking about institutional critique here. This isn't about, like, conspiracy theories in some smoky back room.
Not at all. It's about structural arrangements. It's the free market forces, the internalized assumptions, the simple constraints of ownership and power that, well, they naturally shape the system to serve its own ends. It's about efficiency, not conspiracy.
And the essential, and honestly, it's a pretty sobering insight from the source material, is this. The powerful fix the premises of the entire conversation.
Yes.
They decide, often years before an editor's meeting ever happens or a vote is cast, what the general populace is even allowed to see, hear, and critically, what they're allowed to think about. I mean, you don't have to win every argument if you can control which arguments are allowed in the first place.
And that control absolutely starts with the ultimate gatekeepers of information, the mass media.
Okay, let's start there. We've got this really powerful, specific framework, the propaganda model. It argues that for any piece of news to reach you, it first has to pass through these successive structural filters.
Right. And what's left is what the sources call the cleansed residue fit to print. And the key thing to get here is that these aren't government censors in a room with a red pen.
No, these are market forces that create a kind of self-censorship.
Exactly. These 5 filters are built directly into the financial and operational DNA of the media organizations. They're so effective precisely because they rely on ingrained ideology and, just economic necessity rather than some explicit government mandate. They're self-reinforcing. The system just rewards conformity.
All right, let's break them down. The first filter, size, ownership, and profit orientation. Why does the sheer scale of modern media matter so much?
Well, media firms today are just massive. They're highly concentrated entities, and they are strictly profit-oriented. And often, they're just subsidiaries of even larger multinational corporations whose main business has absolutely nothing to do with journalism.
You have to give us the classic example here.
The textbook case from our sources is General Electric, GE, a huge diversified multinational, right? They're heavily involved in weapons production, jet engines, nuclear power. And for years, they owned RCA, which owned the NBC network.
Wait, just to pause on that. A company that makes components for fighter jets and builds nuclear reactors owns a major news network. That's a direct, fundamental conflict of interest right out of the gate.
It is, and the implications are just vast. GE has an enormous stake in political decisions. I mean, decisions that affect military spending, decisions that affect environmental regulation, energy policy.
So how likely is it that NBC News is going to run a really long, critical investigation into, say, the environmental impact of GE's nuclear business, or campaign hard against a massive defense budget that directly benefits its parent company?
The chances are slim to none. The concentration of ownership means the flow of information is ultimately controlled by entities whose primary strategic interests are corporate and financial, not journalistic or, public service.
And this concern isn't new, right? I mean, you mentioned there's a historical precedent. In the late 1960s, ITT, that's International Telephone and Telegraph, tried to buy ABC.
Yes, and the outcry then was actually pretty significant. It slowed the whole process down. The fear was explicitly that allowing a major multinational corporation with all these foreign investments and business activities to control a major media outlet could compromise the independence of ABC's news coverage.
So, if ITT had billions invested in a shaky regime in South America, the worry was that ABC News coverage of that country might suddenly get very, very gentle.
That was the exact fear.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting part. GE and Westinghouse, who were similarly huge, powerful companies deeply involved in strategic, often controversial industries like arms and nuclear power, they were eventually permitted to own networks.
And the opposition was more muted.
Far more muted. The sources highlight that GE, in particular, was actually more powerful and had a far more extensive international reach. But the lack of opposition meant that GE was in a much better structural position to make sure its sound views got proper attention. It could filter out anything that might challenge its core profit drivers. So the first filter, right away, ensures the owners of the media are tied directly to the elite interests the media is supposed to be covering objectively.
Okay, so if the owners are setting the structural boundaries, the second filter, advertising as the primary income source, this sets the economic incentives. This is more subtle because it's not like overt censorship. It's more of a built-in commercial constraint.
This is absolutely critical to grasp. A commercial media company is not selling a product like a newspaper or a show to you, the reader or the viewer. It is selling an audience. It's selling you to an advertiser.
Right.
And that necessity drives media companies towards strict profitability and, more importantly, specific demographic goals. The media is competing in a market for audiences, but specifically for the wealthy audience.
And why the wealthy audience specifically?
Because advertisers want to reach consumers who have disposable income. A story or a TV segment that attracts a huge but poor audience is, from a commercial standpoint, almost worthless.
But a niche blog or a cable channel that attracts a small but extremely wealthy demographic.
That's gold. Media outlets that can't successfully compete for these key audiences, who are the most attractive consumers, they simply can't generate the revenue they need to survive in a commercial system.
So the economic pressure is just relentless. It's constantly pushing the content towards the preferences and, I guess, the sensibilities of the elite consumer class audience.
Precisely. The system structurally results in the exclusion of viewpoints that might conflict with the commercial interests of the advertisers. Just think about it for a second.
Yeah.
Robust coverage of labor organizing, deep dives into environmental destruction caused by, say, a chemical giant, or efforts to enact aggressive anti-corporate regulations. All of these are viewpoints that could easily alienate a major advertising buyer.
Like a big car company or a pharmaceutical firm.
Of course. The media's fundamental commitment to selling high-value eyeballs creates this powerful built-in bias against content that challenges the status quo of corporate power or how the market operates.
That makes perfect sense. Economic necessity just shapes the editorial boundaries. And this leads us directly to the third filter, which is reliance on official sources. If money dictates who the media speaks to, access dictates what they say.
This filter relies on what economists call information subsidies. I mean, it is just physically and financially so much easier for a journalist on a tight deadline to quote an official source, a government press release, a white paper from a well-funded think tank, a corporate spokesperson, than it is to conduct time-consuming, independent, investigative journalism.
And when you look at the raw numbers on that, the reliance is absolutely staggering. I was genuinely shocked by this statistic from the source material.
Oh.
There are, by one count, 20,000 more public relations agents working to doctor, spin, and disseminate the news today.
Then there are actual full-time journalists writing it.
20,000 more. That's not just a distortion of the process, that's a complete structural inversion.
It is. Instead of journalists investigating power, you have power actively generating the content that journalists then just passively process and distribute to the public.
So how is this reliance weaponized? I mean, beyond just being efficient.
It allows powerful sources to actively manage the media. They can just inundate journalists with press releases, with data dumps. It's known as flooding the channels. And this tactic is old. It dates all the way back to the World War I propaganda efforts.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They discovered that one of the most effective ways to control the news was to just flood the news channels with facts, or what amounted to official information. It does two things. It pushes their specific line of argument, setting the agenda, and critically, it successfully chases unwanted stories off the front page because news space and journalist time are finite resources.
So if a controversial story about, say, a multinational's environmental disaster starts to gain traction, that corporation can just deploy its army of PR agents to flood the media with dozens of counterstories and studies and expert opinions that just drown out the original reporting.
Exactly. It's an exercise in volume control and agenda setting. It ensures that the dominant narrative always originates from the centers of established power.
Okay, but what happens if a truly intrepid news organization manages to break through those first three filters?
Hmm.
They have the money, they have the access, they do the work, and they publish something that genuinely violates elite interests. That's where the fourth filter comes in: flack and discipline.
Flag is the mechanism used to punish that deviation. It's the collective negative feedback, the organized criticism, the massive organized letter writing campaigns, the legal threats, the formal complaints, all deployed to discipline the media. And the key is, this is not spontaneous public outrage.
No, it's engineered outrage.
It's outrage engineered and delivered by well-funded organizations acting on behalf of proprietary interests.
Can you give us a concrete example of this flack in action from our sources?
The sources spend a lot of time detailing the function of organizations like Freedom House. This organization is described as operating as a virtual propaganda arm of the government and the international right wing, and it consistently spends huge resources criticizing the media for being insufficiently supportive of U.S. foreign policy.
So their critique isn't your facts are wrong. It's more like your attitude is wrong. You're not being a team player.
Precisely. Their model suggests that the media shouldn't just report facts neutrally, but should be enthusiastically supportive of the national venture abroad. The most famous example, of course, is their critique that the negative, realistic coverage of the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War helped lose the war.
Wow.
And the implication is crystal clear. If the media is disloyal or insufficiently patriotic, they will suffer a barrage of highly professional, organized flack that threatens their credibility and, just as importantly, their access to those official sources we just talked about.
This sounds like a structural demand for obedience, not just accuracy. And the example from El Salvador you mentioned is also really revealing.
It is. When media reporting from El Salvador showed systematic killing of civilians by the Salvadoran army, which was a U.S. client state Freedom House, denounced the media for an imbalance in their reporting. They were tacitly demanding coverage that was more favorable to the U.S. narrative.
Essentially arguing that if a human rights abuse helps a U.S. strategic ally, the media has a patriotic duty to kind of soft pedal it.
Yes, flack keeps the media in line. It's constantly signaling the boundaries of acceptable dissent.
And finally, that brings us to the fifth filter, which is the big, overarching ideological framework: anti-communism, or as the sources say, its substitute ideologies.
Historically, anti-communism functioned as the universal specter haunting property owners. It was a political control mechanism that successfully mobilized the populace against any threats to fundamental property interests, no matter where they came from. If you wanted to fragment labor movements or push back against regulations or justify a military intervention,
You just labeled the effort communist or socialist.
and the power of that label was immense. It just suspended the demand for any serious evidence. Individuals could achieve instant credibility as experts or witnesses just by attacking the perceived threat. It kept political liberals continuously on the defensive, forcing them to always prove their anti-communist credentials.
Which often led them to, as the sources say, behave very much like reactionaries when they were confronted with indigenous radical movements that were simply trying to address domestic inequality.
Exactly.
But the sources do acknowledge the Soviet Union collapsed. Does that filter still function in the same way?
It adapts. The sources note that while the anti-communist force might have weakened significantly, it's been replaced by what they call the greater ideological force of the belief in the miracle of the market.
Ah, the triumph of capitalism.
The unquestioned triumph of capitalism, the fervent interest in privatization, the acceptance of market rule as the ultimate universal good. This ideology now frames the acceptable bounds of domestic debate. Questions of regulation, taxation, state intervention, in the exact same way anti-communism framed foreign policy debates for decades.
So if you advocate for something like universal health care or heavy climate regulation, you're not just wrong on the merits. You are structurally classified as someone who doesn't believe in the miracle of the market.
Which puts you outside the bounds of serious discussion, just as being a suspected communist once did. It fixes the policy premise. The structure ensures that the acceptable debate is limited to how the market should operate, never whether the market should be the sole determinant of social outcomes.
This whole analysis of the propaganda model is just. It's incredibly robust. It shows the structure of the market is designed to consistently produce this narrow, predictable information environment. So let's make that critical transition now. If the media is filtering what we see and hear, how do these same interests structurally capture the actual levers of state power? How do they make sure policy stays immutable? This is the core of the invisible leash.
This is where that structural control moves from fixing the narrative to actually fixing the policy. And the realization here is that modern democracy is an operating system. It has built-in kill switches that are controlled by financial interests. Think of that analogy from the sources.
The newly elected president.
Yes. The president wins, celebrates a victory, but then they receive that infamous folder from the guy in the charcoal gray suit. And the realization is immediate. They didn't win the right to enact their platform. They won the temporary right to manage a franchise that's already owned by someone else.
That is the difference between surface-level political influence and deep structural control. This isn't just about a lobbyist buying a congressman dinner.
Not even close. This is about the permanent, unchangeable plumbing of global finance and legislative capture. And we have several powerful interlocking mechanisms at play here.
Okay, let's start with mechanism one, the golden revolving door. This really reinforces that principle that personnel is policy.
Right. The old way was to lobby politicians after they're in office. The smarter, more surgical play is to actively supply the regulators and the high-level administrators in the first place.
You're putting your people on the inside.
You ensure that the individuals writing the rules and monitoring compliance are the very same people who will later profit enormously from advising industry on how to loophole those same rules. This is regulatory capture built into the career trajectory itself.
Can you elaborate on the textbook example from 2008? I think the sheer scale of what happened then makes this vital to understand.
Absolutely. When the global financial system completely collapsed in 2008, the government needed a steady hand to manage the chaos and administer TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the multi-billion-dollar bank bailout.
And who did they choose?
The U.S. Treasury Secretary, Henry Paulson. Just 2 years before that, Paulson had been the CEO of Goldman Sachs.
So the chief decision maker allocating billions in taxpayer funds to save Wall Street was, until very recently, the chief executive of one of the firms most directly implicated in the crisis and a primary beneficiary of the bailout.
But it goes even deeper than just a simple conflict of interest. It's the incentive structure. A senior regulator's public service salary is modest, maybe $150,000 a year, but the post-government job, that's the golden parachute.
The job as a lawyer, a consultant, a lobbyist, a board member for the very industry you were just regulating.
Offers millions. This structure requires no outright illegal corruption. It simply incentivizes rational self-interest. If you write tough rules that displease your future employers, that golden parachute just doesn't open. The system selects for and rewards individuals who are sympathetic to or complicit with the interests they're supposed to be regulating.
So the fox isn't just guarding the chickens. The fox is being highly compensated by the chickens for their future post-government consulting work.
It creates a system where industry doesn't even need to lobby for favorable regulations. They just need to ensure that they hire the people who write the regulations in the first place, or promise future wealth to the people who are currently writing them.
Okay, so if the revolving door disciplines the personnel, the true source of discipline for the entire national economy is mechanism two, the bond vigilantes or the invisible leash. This is the structural check on any policy that truly challenges capital.
This is where we have to confront the reality of modern nations running on massive sovereign debt. The sovereign debt market, that's where the true, silent, non-electoral power over national treasuries is held.
You're referring to the political strategist James Carville's famous quote. He said he wanted to be reincarnated as the bond market because you can intimidate everybody.
That quote captured the entire dynamic perfectly. When a new administration proposes policies that truly touch the structural flow of capital, let's say massive new wealth taxes, or aggressive nationalization of strategic industries, or a major overhaul of financial regulation, they run headfirst into the judgment of global debt holders, the so-called bond vigilantes.
How exactly does this invisible leash pull back a sovereign government? How does it work in practice?
The leverage is absolute and it is incredibly fast. If the financial markets perceive a policy change as reckless or disruptive to profit flows, the country's credit rating risks being downgraded by one of the major rating agencies.
And that downgrade immediately causes global investors to dump that country's debt.
Right. As demand falls, interest rates on their debt spike dramatically. The country's currency collapses. And all the stability that ordinary voters depend on, their pension funds, the value of their money, the cost of borrowing, it all becomes instantly unstable or insolvent.
So this essentially gives the financial sector a permanent veto over democratic budgeting decisions.
It enforces what Thomas Friedman famously called the golden straitjacket. Friedman argued that as economies plug into global markets, they gain access to growth and capital, but their political options shrink dramatically.
Democracy is fine, as long as it stays within the lines.
Exactly. Provided it adheres strictly to the guardrails built by those who own the capital and hold the debt.
Yeah.
You can hold elections, you can choose between Party A and Party B, but the policy outcomes must remain within that narrow band that is acceptable to the bond vigilantes. If you deviate from the demands of global debt holders, you risk immediate economic catastrophe, regardless of how popular your platform was at the ballot box.
And if the bond vigilantes are the collective check on government, mechanism 3, capital flight is the individual hypermobile veto power held by the ultra-wealthy.
In a deeply globalized world, money has no allegiance. It is perfectly liquid, and it is capable of instantaneously crossing borders and jurisdictions. So when a government tries to impose a punitive tax or a regulatory scheme that significantly hinders wealth accumulation,
Well, the wealthy can just move their capital, their assets, their transactions, all of it, elsewhere, with the click of a mouse.
the click of a mouse. And we have a perfect illustration of this from the source material regarding the French attempt to impose a high income tax.
Right, tell us about that.
Well, France attempted to impose a 75% income tax on its top earners. The wealthy reacted instantly. Billions of euros in capital fled the country. High net worth individuals moved their residences. Strategic transactions within France just dried up.
So the intended tax revenue never even materialized.
It never materialized. The French government, which was suffering revenue losses and facing instability, was forced to quietly drop the tax a few years later. And the core lesson here is that the government was brought to its knees, as the source says, not by a vote, but by a moving van. This grants capital the ultimate non-electoral veto power over democratic policy simply by threatening to walk away.
So we've established these structural constraints on information flow and on government policy. Now let's see the propaganda model in really striking action. We need to examine these differences in media treatment of broadly similar situations, based strictly on U.S. political and economic interests, particularly in foreign policy.
This dichotomous coverage is the observable evidence of the filter working. It proves the filter is ideological. It's not based on objective criteria like the severity of the human rights abuses, but on whether the perpetrator is an adversary or an ally.
Okay, let's look at case study A, denouncing massacres, comparing Rekak in Kosovo in 1999 and Liquica in East Timor, also in 1999.
Rekak was a series of killings that are denounced immediately and very emphatically by U.S. and NATO officials. The U.S. mainstream media provided heavy, continuous, and largely uncritical attention to this event. And it served a clear purpose.
What was that?
It helped create the moral and emotional basis for the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, which was a clear adversary to U.S. strategic interests in the region.
Okay, now contrast that with what happened in Liquica.
Liquica was an indisputable, straightforward slaughter of civilians by Indonesian organized militia forces. The victims had sought refuge in a Catholic church. Indonesia, however, was a long-time crucial U.S. ally and client state. It was particularly important for regional stability and trade.
So U.S. support of the Indonesian military continued, and critically, U.S. officials did not denounce the massacre. They didn't use it to justify any intervention.
None at all.
And the difference in media coverage must have been vast.
It was astronomical. The source material provides the hard data on this. Over a 12-month period following each event, mentions of Rekak in the media exceeded mentions of Liquica by a ratio of 4.1 to 1.
At 4 to 1.
But then when you analyze the use of the morally loaded word massacre, the ratio swelled to 6.7 to 1. And when measured by sheer word count dedicated to the topic, the ratio was 14 to 1 in favor of the atrocity committed by the adversary.
14 to 1. And Newsweek.
Newsweek, for instance, mentioned Rekak and its massacre 9 times, but failed to mention Liquica even once.
That statistical bias-heavy coverage and moral indignation for the enemy's atrocity and just minimal attention for the allies' atrocity, that is a direct function of the propaganda model's ideological filter.
It connects directly to strategic utility. So if Turkey, a key NATO ally and client state, carried out severe abuses against its Kurdish population, the media coverage was predictably minimal, and the powerful term genocide was rarely, if ever, applied to describe these actions. The strategic interests of the owners and the government dictate the application of moral outrage and the allocation of journalistic resources.
And this selective indignation is further illustrated by case study B, the terminology of tyrants. Here we're comparing Pol Pot of Cambodia with Suharto of Indonesia. Both were perpetrators of mass murder, but one was a key U.S. client state.
When Pol Pot was in the news in 1998, he was consistently described in news columns and editorials across the mainstream media with active, morally charged language. Crazed, a killer, a war criminal, a mass murderer, and responsible for genocide. This is all appropriate, of course, but it serves the ideological filter because Pol Pot was an enemy.
So how was Suharto treated? The U.S. ally who came to power via a military coup that involved the massacres of hundreds of thousands of supposed communists.
He was treated with exceptional linguistic delicacy. He was referred to as a dictator or running an authoritarian regime, but never a killer or mass murderer or responsible for genocide. The media consistently avoided language that would demand moral intervention or political condemnation.
And the sources point out the use of the passive voice is particularly revealing here. It strips the agent of responsibility.
Precisely. The New York Times, for example, referred to a 1965 coup led to the massacres of hundreds of thousands of supposed communists. Notice the structure there. The coup led to the massacres. This construction gives no agent doing the killing.
The atrocity is described as just an event that happened.
Or was caused by an inanimate political event rather than being a deliberate action taken by the U.S.-backed regime. Furthermore, the preferred term used for the slaughter was often purge instead of massacre or slaughter, terms that, again, avoid moral condemnation and agency. This terminological double standard is maintained reliably across the mainstream press. It's proof of the filter's influence on the very language we use.
Okay, let's move to case study C. The flawed Russian election of 1996. This shows the filter in action when a democratic process directly conflicts with elite economic interests.
The 1996 Russian election was fundamentally important to the West because Boris Yeltsin was carrying out the favored policy of rapid, widespread privatization, but he was deeply unpopular. He had presided over a 50% fall in national output, massive corruption, and he had an abysmal 8% popularity rating before the campaign even started.
So he was threatened with defeat by a communist challenger.
Right. So Yeltsin was the preferred choice of the Western financial elite, but he was not the choice of the Russian people.
So how did the propaganda model address this conflict?
By celebrating the result and minimizing all the flaws. Despite extensive campaign violations and serious questions about the legitimacy of the vote, the U.S. mainstream media, epitomized by the New York Times, declared Yeltsin's re-election a victory for Russian democracy.
The victory for Russian democracy.
The coverage ignored or intentionally slighted the known flaws and instead claimed the very fact of holding an imperfect election was a remarkable achievement. The message was clear. As long as the market-friendly candidate wins, the process is deemed democratic enough.
And we see the same bias in the reporting on Putin's 2000 victory, right? He was also supported by the West at the time, seen as a reformer who would continue privatization.
Yes. Despite Putin relying heavily on state TV and radio campaigning, denigrating opponents, and compelling evidence of fraud, including ballot stuffing and the use of 1.3 million dead souls to inflate the election rolls, all documented by the expatriate Moscow Times, the U.S. media was very reluctant to report these findings aggressively.
So the rule is, if the outcome supports elite policy interests like privatization, flaws are ignored or minimized. If an outcome opposes elite interest, every flaw is magnified and denounced as intolerable.
This systemic bias defines the borders of acceptable political reality, and it creates a persistent problem. The public is constantly steered away from considering policy alternatives that might threaten the foundational structures of power and property. The media acts as a structural deterrent against thinking outside the preferred box.
Okay, let's pivot back to domestic policy and see how this structural bias impacts public health and safety, especially when corporate interests clash directly with the public good. We need to look at the chemical industry and regulatory capture.
This is maybe the clearest example of the fox guarding the chickens arrangement being built directly into law. The sources reveal a stunning reality regarding safety testing. The system leaves virtually all safety research and testing in the hands of the industry itself.
So the industry decides when and which results are worthy of transmission to the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. They're self-regulating the data.
That's the structural reality. The EPA is almost entirely dependent on that self-reported data for its decisions. The chemical industry often claims that safety is assured by regulation, yet at the same time, it actively works to keep those regulations weak, underfunded, and reliant on their own reporting. And this inadequate system has demonstrably failed to deal with the vast majority of chemicals on the market.
Especially when it comes to long-term or interactive effects.
Exactly. Long-term additive or interactive effects on the human body or the environment.
And this industry power, it manifests most clearly in their bitter opposition to the precautionary principle. What exactly is the precautionary principle, and why does the industry hate it so much?
The precautionary principle, which is widely adopted in Europe, basically states that you shouldn't release chemicals into the environment without comprehensive testing. And critically, it compels the use of non-threatening alternatives where they exist. The burden of proof is on the producer to show a substance is safe before it hits the market.
And the U.S. industry fiercely opposes this.
Fiercely. They prefer the current system where chemicals are released and the burden of proof falls on regulators or injured parties to prove harm after the fact. And they argue that the existing U.S. system is based on sound science.
Which our sources categorize as a fundamentally political decision, not a scientific one.
Right. Science doesn't tell us what risks are acceptable. Society does. Yet the industry continually uses the phrase sound science as a shield. And this claim is highly questionable when you consider that chemicals often aren't tested for all the relevant variables, like their long-term effects on immune systems, reproductive systems, or the complex interactive effects of multiple chemicals combined in the environment.
When you look at history, the industry's claim to sound science becomes even thinner. History is just littered with examples of industry denial that turned out to be genuinely harmful.
Absolutely. Think of tetraethyl lead, PCBs, asbestos, DDT, Agent Orange. In every single case, industry long denied evidence of harm, only withdrawing or being regulated after overwhelming legal, scientific, or political pressure forced the issue. Our sources note a persistent, sharp difference between the results of industry-sponsored science and those of independent researchers working the same terrain.
Not to mention documented cases of testing fraud.
And political manipulation designed to weaken standards. And this manipulation is heavily reinforced by how the media filters scientific discourse. This is where we see the media framing of science in action.
So how does that play out?
The media have largely internalized and accepted the industry's rhetorical framework. The industry claims to support sound science, and they frame their critics, environmentalists, tort lawyers, public health advocates as purveyors of junk science.
We have specific data on this framing.
We do. From 1996 through 1998, 62% of mainstream newspaper articles that use the phrase junk science applied it to environmentalists, corporate critics, or tort lawyers.
And how often did that phrase refer to corporate abuses of science or industry-funded misleading studies?
Only 8%. That is normalization. The media has normalized the industry's self-legitimizing usage. It establishes a structural status quo of caveat emptor buyer beware rather than a safety-first regulatory environment.
Furthermore, the media frequently dismisses genuine concerns as just unwarranted scares.
Yes, these alleged scares over things like dioxin or alar on apples, which often turn out to be real, verified health hazards, are framed as overblown hysteria. And critically, major appeals by legitimate scientific bodies are virtually ignored. For example, the International Joint Commission's repeated appeal to end chlorine manufacturing because of its dangerous flow into the Great Lakes.
Has received virtually no national media attention.
Exactly, because that appeal threatens a powerful industry interest. The filter ensures that the debate remains framed in terms of balancing jobs against junk science rather than prioritizing public health.
And this domestic filtering is just as evident when major political investors agree on an issue, which leads to the exclusion of mass deliberation.
This relies on the political scientist Thomas Ferguson's theory. If the major political investors, the corporate interests that fund both dominant parties, agree on an issue, the two parties will only compete on minor tactical differences. They'll totally exclude discussion of genuine alternatives.
Can you give us a clear, non-negotiable example of this kind of consensus policy?
Defense spending is the textbook case. Polls consistently show that a substantial majority of the public wants a smaller defense budget and a spending shift towards civil functions like education or infrastructure.
Yet both dominant political parties consistently promise to enlarge the defense budget. Why?
Because the major investors, the defense contractors, the military-industrial complex, they agree that a large defense budget is desirable, profitable, and structurally necessary. And the media follows suit, limiting the debate to minor questions of which weapon system to buy, not whether the budget should be drastically cut in the first place.
And the same dynamic defined the contentious debate around NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
The elite consensus was massive. Polls consistently showed a substantial majority of the public opposed NAFTA before it was enacted, and later opposed the subsequent investor bailout. But the elite was overwhelmingly in favor. So media editorials, news coverage, and the selection of experts were heavily skewed toward that elite preference. They framed the benefits of NAFTA as obvious and universally agreed upon by qualified authorities.
And the public opposition, which included labor, women, and minorities, was treated with, well, disdain.
They were framed as uninformed and acting against their own true long-term interests. The media largely ignored the opposition's arguments and attacked labor's efforts to influence the debate, while at the same time completely ignoring the intense corporate lobbying efforts pushing for the treaty. The structural bias ensures that when the powerful agree, the democratic conversation ends.
And what happened when the inevitable crisis came, just 11 months after NAFTA went into effect, resulting in a massive flight of capital from Mexico and a devaluation?
The media consensus immediately shifted to ensuring NAFTA itself was not blamed. They universally supported the investor bailout despite fierce public opposition. And what's truly revealing about the structural mindset is that experts and pundits celebrated that NAFTA had locked Mexico in. It couldn't alter its overall policy direction to protect its citizens from deflation and unemployment because of the trade agreement.
They were oblivious to the profoundly undemocratic nature of this structural lock-in.
Completely oblivious, a lock-in that had been negotiated by a Mexican government that ruled as a result of documented electoral fraud.
It appears the entire structure, from media filters to financial constraints, is designed to funnel policy outcomes toward the preferences of capital, regardless of democratic input or even objective facts about public health or economic stability.
The system is designed not just to win individual battles, but to perpetually control the battlefield itself.
Okay, so let's delve into the final set of mechanisms that define this perpetual control, the deep infrastructure of permanent policy capture. How do elite interests actively manufacture the laws and secure the final long-term check on government power?
We've seen the passive constraints. Now we need to look at the active construction of power.
Let's start with mechanism 4. The think tank and legislative laundering. This is all about turning raw, self-interested corporate desires into sophisticated, legitimate-sounding public policy.
The process is remarkably elegant and efficient. If a billionaire just comes out and asks for lower capital gains taxes, it sounds like naked self-interest.
Right.
But if that same idea is laundered through a nonpartisan academic institute or a prominent think tank, it suddenly sounds like smart, growth-oriented policy. These organizations hire experts, often academics who didn't get tenure or former political staffers and future lobbyists, to write these elaborate white papers that inevitably conclude that the desired policy will lead to economic growth and job creation.
So it creates the necessary veneer of intellectual and scientific consensus where none may actually exist. It gives politicians and media outlets the talking points they need.
And it goes even further, right down to the actual writing of the legislation, which often bypasses the messiness of public debate entirely. We have to talk about the American Legislative Exchange Council, known as ALECE.
What do they do?
This is an organization that functions as a full-service legislative shop for corporations and state legislators. They literally write model laws word for word.
So a company doesn't need to lobby 50 state legislatures individually. They write one model bill, ALECE delivers it, and legislators across the country introduce it as their own, often without a single modification.
It's the ultimate pipeline for injecting corporate interests directly into the lawmaking process nationwide. It creates immediate, widespread policy based on corporate desires, effectively bypassing public input and legislative drafting committees.
That concentration of power isn't only legislative, it's also narrative. We discussed the filters, but the result is mechanism 5, the narrative monopoly or manufacturing consent.
To maintain control in a democracy, you must ultimately control the voters. And the cheapest, most effective way to do that is to rig the narrative, ensuring the populace is mobilized to support the system's preferred outcomes. The physical foundation of this control is the staggering concentration of media ownership.
We have the numbers on that.
Our sources cite that in 1983, 50 companies owned 90% of American media. Today, that number has shrunk to just 6 corporations controlling virtually all mainstream content.
6 corporations controlling 90% of the message we consume. That drastically simplifies narrative control. It makes it exponentially easier to ensure conformity across different outlets.
It allows for the precise management of the national political reality. Now, if they control the money, the personnel, and the narrative, the final safeguard is the ability to veto any unwanted legislation that manages to slip through the system. And that's Mechanism 6, the judicial veto.
This is often cited as the best ROI, the best return on investment in the history of elite influence.
And for very good reason. The 1% didn't just spend money on elections. They invested decades and hundreds of millions of dollars into shaping the judiciary, focusing particularly on the Supreme Court. They systematically transformed what was historically considered the weakest branch of government into the strongest and most reliable check on popular legislative will.
They bought themselves a permanent insurance policy against democracy.
Exactly. By securing favorable court decisions related to campaign finance, regulatory authority, and corporate power, they established a structural, long-term veto over the entire U.S. code. Any piece of legislation, whether it's a strict environmental law or a major attempt at labor reform, can eventually be struck down or rendered toothless by a court that is sympathetic to the structural interests of capital.
This is the permanent non-electoral check on popular democracy.
And it ensures that policy outcomes are ultimately dictated by unelected, life-tenured judges.
Finally, we have to address the mechanism that, cleans up the public relations crime scene. And that's Mechanism 7, the philanthropy distraction, or the hese complex.
Philanthropy, exemplified by mega foundations like the Gates, Rockefeller, and Clinton foundations, often operates as a public relations mechanism. It expertly diverts public and media attention away from the structural harms caused by concentrated capital. We are conditioned to look at the generous acts and applaud the goodness of billionaires, rather than question the structure that allowed for that concentration of wealth in the first place.
But the critique here reveals a dual-purpose strategy: tax avoidance and global power projection.
Let's start with tax avoidance. When a billionaire transfers wealth into a vast, tax-exempt trust, that money is effectively removed from the public purse forever. Money that should have gone to the government to pay for schools, roads, or public services is now permanently shielded from taxation and placed under the private control of the donor and their appointed trustees.
They get to decide where public funds should have gone.
And they get a tax break for doing it. Then there's the power projection. This is where philanthropy starts shaping global policy, often bypassing elected officials entirely.
How does that work?
These private foundations use their vast, tax-exempt funds to dictate global policy priorities. They can heavily influence organizations like the World Health Organization, setting global health agendas, often in alignment with underlying economic interests, whether that's intentional or not. They are using tax-sheltered private funds to exert massive influence over public goods like health, education, or agriculture influence that the public never elected them to wield.
So it's a method of controlling policy priorities and directing capital flows globally, while simultaneously earning moral praise and avoiding public accountability.
Exactly.
When you lay out this entire system, the media filters, the economic leashes, the legislative pipelines, the judicial veto, it paints a picture of incredibly comprehensive structural control.
It brings us right back to that initial analogy. The ultimate realization is that the government is merely the steering wheel. It's the user interface designed to make the populace feel like they are in control. You can turn the wheel, you can debate the minor policy differences between the two parties.
But the engine, the transmission, and the road itself, that is structurally owned by elite interests.
They own the personnel through the golden revolving door. They own the debt through the bond vigilantes. They manufacture the laws through the think tanks. They control the truth through the narrative monopoly. And they own the final check through the judicial veto. This is not a system that is failing to meet democratic goals. It's a system that is functioning exactly as it was structurally designed to.
It's a very sobering reality, but you have to understand that the longevity of this system relies entirely on your cynicism. It relies on you checking out. They need the public to believe that voting is pointless, that it's all hopelessly rigged, so that you disengage entirely.
Because when the public checks out, they can operate in the dark with total impunity.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The only historical periods where this structural control lost significant ground, I'm thinking of the foundational reforms of the New Deal, the establishment of the post-war welfare states, or the peak influence of strong labor unions, were precisely when the population stopped watching the superficial puppet show of conventional politics.
And started looking intently at the strings. They became terrified of a population that truly understood how the bond market works, how narratives are manufactured, and how the permanent institutional infrastructure actually functions.
Knowledge is the greatest weapon against structural control because it replaces that fatalistic cynicism with actionable understanding. What previously looked like random political failure or just incompetence now reveals itself as highly predictable institutional function. It's a function that is designed to protect capital above all else.
So, now that you can identify the strings, what issue in your own life, whether it's the lack of aggressive climate change regulation, persistent income inequality, or the immovable defense budget, when you view it through these 5 media filters and these 7 mechanisms of policy capture, what changes from just a fleeting political argument to a structural certainty? The structure relies on your ignorance. Get smart.